He wasn't staring at the door. He was slowly rotating in the center of the tent, tracking the heavy, crushing footsteps that were circling us in the dark. I was 16 years old. It was the summer before my junior year, and my family owned a piece of land up in northern Michigan. This wasn't a campground or a resort. It was just 40 acres of raw, mixed forest and open field, completely off the grid. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just deep woods. My parents let me go up there alone for the weekend. Their only condition was that I take the family dog, Bear. Bear was a chow and black lab mix weighing about 80 pounds, built like a tank with a thick double coat. He looked intimidating, but honestly, he was the most mild-mannered animal you'd ever meet. He never barked, never chased anything. He was just steady. I packed light, a two-man tent, some food, a lantern, and a small hatchet for firewood. I set up camp in a clearing near the tree line that Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect. The woods were quiet, just the crackling of the burning wood and the wind in the pines. I slept like a rock that first night. Saturday was just as peaceful. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag that night, I had that deep, satisfying exhaustion you only get from being outside all day. Bear curled up at my feet. I turned off the lantern, and I was out. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, but I didn't wake up because I heard a noise. I woke up because Bear was standing. The warm weight at the foot of my sleeping bag was gone, replaced by this low vibration. It took my sleep-addled brain a second to realize it was a growl, but not a normal dog growl. It was almost subsonic. I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. In all the years we had him, Bear had never made a sound like that. I sat up slowly. I couldn't see much, but I could make out his silhouette. He was standing dead center in the tent, legs braced wide, every hair on his back standing straight up. His teeth were bared, and he was slowly turning. I tried to tell myself it was just a coyote or a raccoon, just an animal. But then I heard the footsteps. These weren't the subtle rustlings of a small animal in the leaves. These were deliberate, heavy, crushing footsteps, moving in a slow circle around us, and underneath those heavy steps was the breathing. It was a slow, wet snort, rhythmic, deep. Whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. It knew exactly where we were. My body completely froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't swallow. My breathing felt deafeningly loud in my own ears. I blindly felt around the dark tent, my shaking hand finally closing around the handle of my small firewood hatchet. I gripped it so tight my fingers went numb. I was 16 years old, miles from anyone, and I had never felt such pure, paralyzing terror in my life. Bear finished his slow rotation and stopped, facing the entrance flap of the tent. The growl shifted. It got lower, more focused. The footsteps outside had stopped. It was standing right outside the door. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Me clutching a tiny hatchet in the dark. Bear ready to tear apart whatever came through that zipper. Just waiting. Listening to that slow, wet breathing. And then, gradually, the tension broke. I never heard the footsteps walk away. I never heard the breathing fade. One second it was there, and the next, it just wasn't. Bear's hackles slowly lowered. He sat down and pressed his heavy body hard against my leg. But he never took his eyes off the door. Neither of us slept a wink. We sat in the dark until the tent slowly turned from black to pale morning blue. As soon as there was enough light, I unzipped the flap. The clearing was empty. But when I walked around to the back of the tent, my blood ran cold. The grass was crushed flat. and in a patch of soft dirt, there was a massive partial impression. I couldn't tell you exactly what made it, but I can tell you it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't human. I threw my gear into my truck and was on the highway in under 40 minutes. Bear sat in the passenger seat the whole way home, head up, wide awake. I told my parents the trip was fine. I never told them what really happened. Northern Michigan has a lot of wildlife. Maybe there's a logical explanation. But I keep coming back to that slow, wet breathing right outside my head. It wasn't just moving through the woods. It stopped. It was waiting. I still don't know what it wanted, but I've never gone camping alone since, and I never will. I was always told that if I looked out into the deep woods and saw someone I knew, I was supposed to turn around and pretend I didn't see them. But when the lightning struck and the entire holler lit up in brilliant white, the silhouette standing at the edge of the tree line didn't look like anyone I knew. It didn't even look human. Originally, I'm from West Virginia. I spent my childhood bouncing around between the Midwest and the deep Appalachians, but there is one specific place and one specific year that I've spent the rest of my life trying to forget. Between the ages of 10 and 13, I lived in rural Kentucky. We were nestled in the foothills of one of the oldest mountain ranges on the planet. I want you to really think about that for a second. These mountains are ancient. They have been standing since before animals crawled out of the ocean. There's a weight to them, a heavy, suffocating feeling that something ancient is always watching you from the tree line. I lived with my dad and my grams. We lived in what locals call a holler. If you don't know what that is, imagine a neighborhood shaped like a cul-de-sac, but instead of houses, you are completely boxed in by steep, densely forested hills. We lived right in the middle of it. We had family on either side of our double-wide trailer, but no one lived across from us, and no one lived behind us. It was just us and the foothills. When I first moved in, my gram sat me down at the kitchen table. She had a list of rules I had to follow. At the time, I was just a kid. I chalked it up to standard hillbilly stranger danger. Some of the rules were normal. Don't mess around with wild animals. Don't go out into the deep woods alone. But then the rules got strange, specific. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Never whistle after the sun goes down. If you hear someone call your name from the trees, know you didn't. You don't answer, and you certainly don't go looking for them." And the last rule, the one she repeated the most, if you look out into the woods and see someone you think you know, no you didn't. You turn around and you come straight home. I didn't understand why she was so serious. Not until August of my 11th year. My dad and I had this mowed path that cut through the tall grass and the thick blackberry bushes to the left of our trailer. We had set up a permanent camping spot out there. It was far enough away to feel like a wilderness adventure, but close enough that we could easily walk back and check on grams. If you have never been in the deep woods at night, you need to understand something. The woods are loud. You have nocturnal animals moving through the brush. You have the constant, deafening chatter of cicadas and bugs. You have the wind dragging through millions of leaves. And running right along the dirt road near our camp, there was a rushing stream. That night, we added the crackle and pop of a campfire to the orchestra of the holler. It was getting late, and my dad decided he was going to walk the quarter-mile back up to the house to grab some more beer and check on grams. Before he unzipped the tent to leave, he pointed a stern finger at me. "Do not mess with the fire while I'm gone." I nodded. He zipped up the tent, and I listened to his heavy boots crunch against the dirt path until the sound faded completely into the noise of the forest. I was alone, but I had been left at the campsite alone before. I wasn't scared. I sat in my camping chair, poking the dirt with a stick, watching the orange embers dance in the dark. And then the woods died. I don't mean it got quiet, I mean the sound was vacuumed out of the air. It's what survivalists call the Oz effect. The wind just stopped. The trees went dead still. The deafening chatter of the bugs shut off like someone flipped a switch. Even the rushing stream, which was less than 50 yards away, suddenly sounded like it was miles and miles in the distance. The silence was so heavy it made my ears ring. The hair on my arm stood straight up. Every instinct in my primitive 11-year-old brain was screaming that I had just dropped to the bottom of the food chain. Then came the smell. It didn't drift in on a breeze. It just suddenly manifested thick and heavy in the humid August air. It smelled like raw ozone and hot burning metal. Before I could even process the smell, I tasted it. It coated the back of my throat, a sharp, awful metallic tang, like I had a mouthful of old pennies and copper wire. It made my stomach violently churn. I was frozen in my camping chair, staring out into the pitch-black wall of trees just beyond the firelight, terrified to even blink. After what felt like an eternity, I heard my dad's footsteps coming back down the trail. He burst into the clearing, and he was furious. He didn't even ask if I was okay. He immediately started yelling, asking why the hell it smelled like burning metal. He accused me of throwing his empty beer cans into the campfire. I was almost crying. I told him I didn't touch it. I pointed to the glowing embers to prove there was no aluminum in the fire. He stared at the fire for a long time. Then he looked out into the silent black woods. His anger vanished, replaced by something I rarely saw in my father: urgency. "There's a bad storm coming in," he muttered, not looking at me. "We need to get back to the house. Now." He didn't bother putting the fire out. We just grabbed our jackets, left the tent open, and started the quarter-mile walk back up the path. Now, there's a very cool but very terrifying thing about lightning in woods this dense. When a flash of lightning hits, it lights up the holler like it's high noon, but only up to the front edge of the trees. The canopy is so thick that the light can't penetrate the woods. So you get this brilliant flash of the yard, and behind it, a wall of impenetrable solid black. We made it back to the double wide. It was pitch black outside now, and it had started to lightly rain. The only illumination was the dim yellow glow bleeding out from our living room windows. Because it was a muggy August night, I grabbed a slice of watermelon from the fridge and stepped out onto the covered front porch to watch the storm roll in. The first clap of lightning hit. The entire holler lit up in brilliant, stark white. I could see the porch, the yard, the stream, the dirt road, and the ditches on either side, and I could see the edge of the first line of trees. Then, pitch black again. I took a bite of my watermelon, waiting for the next flash. The second clap of lightning hit. White light flooded the valley. That was when I saw it, way out there, past the yard, over the stream, just past the road and the ditch, standing right at the edge of the tree line. A silhouette. Then, the world went dark again. I stopped chewing. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to tell myself it was a weird shadow or a dead tree trunk I hadn't noticed before. But as the darkness held, that awful putrid smell of burning metal washed over the porch. The taste of copper flooded the back of my throat again. The third flash of lightning hit. The figure was closer. It had crossed the ditch. It was standing on our side of the road, fully illuminated for a fraction of a second. I was standing up now. The watermelon dropped from my hand, hitting the wooden porch boards. It has been 20 years since that night. I've tried over and over to find the words to describe what the lightning revealed, but my brain rejects it. It just couldn't be processed. The best way I can describe it is this. Imagine you asked a person who had been blind since birth to draw a picture of a human being. They know the pieces, but they don't know how they fit together. That is what this thing looked like. Its head wasn't proportioned to its body. It was too large, sitting wrong on its shoulders. The torso was stretched, strangely elongated. But the arms were way too long, hanging down past where its knees should have been. It looked like a mockery of a person, something wearing a shape it didn't fully understand. The flash ended. Blackness swallowed the yard. I didn't wait for the next flash. I didn't care if it was standing in the middle of the yard. I spun around, grabbed the screen door, and threw myself into the house. My Grams was at the sink doing dishes. She looked over her shoulder, wiping her hands on a towel. "Why are you inside?" she asked. I was hyperventilating. I looked at her, trembling, and said, I think I saw something by the road." I will never forget the look on my grandmother's face. The casual warmth instantly vanished. She dropped the towel. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't ask if I was sure. She screamed for my dad. He came out of the back room, vaguely drunk, but Grams was already in motion. "Shut the doors, lock the windows, pull the blinds, right now." My dad didn't argue. The sheer panic in her voice sobered him up instantly. We ran through the trailer, slamming windows shut, throwing the deadbolts, and pulling every curtain tight. That night, I was too terrified to sleep in my own room. I slept in my Grams's bed, listening to the rain beat against the metal roof, waiting to hear something scratching at the walls. The sun finally came up. The storm had passed. When my dad and I walked back down the mowed path to clean up the campsite, we stopped dead in our tracks. The heavy canvas door of our tent had been ripped completely off, but it wasn't shredded by claws, it wasn't chewed. It looked like two massive hands had taken the thick material and just pulled it apart by brute force. An hour later, we got a call from my uncle, who lived about a mile up the holler. Something had gotten into his coop overnight. All 8 of his chickens were dead, but they weren't eaten. Their heads had been cleanly removed, and there wasn't a single drop of blood left in the coop. For the next 3 weeks, everything changed. None of the kids were allowed to wait by the dirt road for the school bus alone. An adult had to stand out there with a shotgun every single morning. My dad was late for work for 3 weeks straight, just to stand with me. But here's the strangest part. Anytime I tried to bring up what I saw in the lightning, they changed the subject. Immediately. It wasn't just my dad. It was my uncle, my Grams, everyone. I just figured I was a kid and they thought I had an overactive imagination. It wasn't until years later that I finally understood. I was in my early 20s. Some cousins were in town for a Halloween party, and we were sitting around a fire pit trading scary stories. I decided to tell them about the thing I saw in the holler when I was 11. I was barely halfway through the story when my aunt stood up. She was irate. Her face was red, and she pointed a trembling finger at me. "Don't you tell them that," she said. "Don't you put that evil on them." The party went dead silent. And suddenly, my adult mind clicked the pieces together. When I was a kid, they weren't changing the subject because they thought I was lying. They were actively shushing me. They were terrified to speak of it. Once I got older and started researching Appalachian folklore, I realized there was a name for the thing with the impossible body. The thing that smells like burning copper and mimics the shape of a man. My aunt had called it by its name that night at the party, and thousands of other people in those ancient mountains have seen it too. Some call it a fleshgait, some call it the goatman. But what bothers me the most, even now, 20 years later, is that no matter how hard I try, I still cannot fully describe its face, and I have never, not once, encountered that horrific taste of burning metal again. So friends, if you ever find yourself driving through the foothills of Kentucky and you rent a cabin deep in the holler, please remember my Grams rules. If you see someone you know in the tree line, no you didn't. Turn around and go back inside. Every time the blinding light hit the tent, we stared at the fabric, absolutely terrified that we were going to see the silhouette of a person standing right outside. And then, the light clicked off. About 10 years ago, my wife and I decided to take a massive road trip around Nova Scotia. We were younger, trying to do the whole thing on a tight budget, which meant avoiding hotels and mostly hopping between public and private campgrounds. For the first few weeks, it was the trip of a lifetime. The scenery was beautiful, the weather was holding up, and we felt totally free. But road trips have a way of catching up to you. By the time we hit the area near Antigonish, the fatigue had set in deep. It was getting late, maybe around 8 in the evening, and the sun was already starting its slow dip below the tree line. We were miles away from any official campground. Our phones were barely holding onto a single bar of service, and we were just bone tired. We pulled into a small fluorescent-lit local diner, mostly just to stretch our legs and ask for directions. We asked the waitress if there was anywhere nearby, some hidden spot off the highway, where we could just pitch a tent for the night for free without being bothered by local police. She gave us a slightly weird look, wiped down the counter, and pointed us toward a public park sitting on a high cliff overlooking the ocean a few miles out of town. We thanked her and drove back out into the fading light. The drive up to the park was a winding, unpaved gravel road that seemed to go on forever. The trees pressed in close to the car, and by the time we reached the clearing at the top, it was completely dark. The isolation was immediate. The park was essentially a massive grass clearing perched on the edge of a sheer cliff. On 3 sides, it was bordered by incredibly dense, black woods. On the 4th side was the drop-off to the ocean. The only sign of life was an older, massive 5th-wheel RV parked at the absolute furthest edge of the lot, near the tree line. There were no lights on inside it. We didn't see a couple, didn't hear a generator. It just sat there in the dark, looking totally abandoned. There was a towering, ancient-looking lighthouse right by the parking area. We were so exhausted we didn't even think about the logistics of it. We just wanted to sleep. So we set up our small 2-man tent on the flat grass right at the base of the lighthouse. That was our first and worst mistake. Because as soon as the last remnants of daylight vanished over the horizon, the lighthouse woke up. It wasn't a steady beam. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. 2 seconds of blinding, searing white light that swept across our clearing, followed by exactly 3 seconds of absolute, pitch-black darkness. 2 seconds of light, 3 seconds of black, over and over. It made it impossible to sleep, but worse than the light itself was the strobe effect it created inside our tent. When the light hit the thin nylon of our tent, the entire inside illuminated with a sickly yellow glow. It cast these long, warped, stretching shadows of the surrounding trees directly onto our walls. They looked like massive twisted fingers reaching over us. And then, just as your eyes adjusted to the brightness, snap, total darkness. The kind of darkness where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. We were just lying there in our sleeping bags, my wife tossing and turning, trying to press pillows over our eyes to ignore the flashing when it started. It was maybe 2 in the morning. From deep inside the dense woods bordering the clearing, we started hearing things. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was just the wind whipping off the ocean, howling through the branches. But wind doesn't sound like that. Wind doesn't have a melody. It started as a low, rhythmic humming. It sounded human, but completely devoid of emotion, just a continuous vibrating hum that seemed to drift out from between the trees. My wife stopped moving. She reached out in the dark and gripped my arm. Her nails were digging into my skin. but neither of us dared to speak. We just laid there, frozen, listening. Then the humming shifted. It rose in pitch and broke into a moan. It was an agonizing, drawn-out sound. It sounded like a person in deep physical pain, and right after the moan, it fractured into these short, sharp, gasping cries, weeping. And the worst part, it wasn't staying in one place. The sound was moving. It was echoing from the trees, slowly pacing around the perimeter of the clearing, pacing around us. The psychological torture of those sounds, combined with that relentless flashing lighthouse, was enough to drive someone insane. During the 3 seconds of total suffocating darkness, we would hear the weeping get louder, closer, footsteps snapping twigs in the brush, and then flash. 2 seconds of blinding light. During those 2 seconds, we would stare with wide, terrified eyes at the illuminated fabric of the tent. Every single time the light hit, we were absolutely paralyzed by the thought that we were going to see the silhouette of a person, or something worse, standing right outside the nylon, hovering over us. Flash. Just tree shadows. Darkness. The weeping gets closer. Flash. Still, just trees. Darkness. A heavy crunch of gravel just a few yards away. Every flash of light felt like a jump scare waiting to happen. I lay there with my keys clutched in my fist, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard, physically hurt. We couldn't run to the car. To do that, we would have to unzip the tent and step out into the blinding strobe and the pitch black, completely exposed to whatever was circling us. So we did the only thing we could do. We waited. I sighed deeply. We laid completely rigid, not speaking, barely breathing for hours. Eventually, the sounds in the woods just stopped, faded away into the crashing of the ocean. But we didn't move. Not until the sun finally started to bleed over the horizon and the lighthouse clicked off. We packed up the tent in record time. We didn't speak. We didn't make breakfast. I didn't even look toward the tree line. We threw our gear into the trunk and sped down that gravel road back to the highway. I still don't know who or what was making those noises in the dark. And honestly, I hope I never find out. The light under the crack of the door was suddenly broken by 2 distinct dark shapes. Something had stepped inside the house, and it was standing right outside my bedroom. I have always loved the idea of isolation, the romanticized version of it anyway. So when I found a small cabin for rent in the deep woods of Arkansas, situated right on the edge of a rushing river, miles away from the main highway, I booked it immediately. The listing sold it as the ultimate off-grid getaway. The drive-in should have been my first warning. The paved road turned to gravel, the gravel turned to dirt, and my GPS completely died about 5 miles before I even reached the property. The trees grew so thick and hung so low over the road that it felt like driving through a green tunnel. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was just starting to set. The layout of the place was weird from the absolute start. The front of the cabin faced the dirt driveway, looking normal enough, but the entire back wall, the side facing the dense woods and the river, was made entirely of floor-to-ceiling windows. During the day, it was beautiful. It offered this massive panoramic view of the water and the trees. But there was a glaring problem. There were absolutely no blinds, no curtains, nothing to pull across the glass. The moment the sun went down, the cabin completely transformed. It became a fishbowl. Because we had the lights on inside, the glass just acted like giant black mirrors. We couldn't see a single thing outside. It was just a wall of impenetrable darkness. But anyone, or anything, standing in those woods could see every square inch of the living room. They could watch our every move, and we wouldn't be able to see them until their face was pressed flat against the glass. It gave me this constant creeping paranoia, this heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched from the tree line. My heart rate picked up, and I spoke with rising intensity. The very first night, things went violently wrong. My friend and I had just turned off the TV. The cabin was dead quiet except for the distant rush of the river. We were sitting on the couch, trying to ignore the massive wall of black glass next to us, when the sound started. Bang! A massive, heavy impact against the front wall of the cabin. It was so loud it rattled the picture frames. We both jumped, staring at the front door. Silence for about 10 seconds. Then, 3 bangs. It was a frantic, aggressive beating sound, but it wasn't coming from just the front door anymore. It shifted instantly to the side wall. Then, a second later, it was directly above us, pounding on the roof. Whatever was out there was moving around the outside of the cabin way faster than a human being should be able to run. It was leaping from the ground to the roof, circling the walls, pounding with incredible force. I sounded frantic, the fear completely taking over. At the exact same moment, the cabin's electronics completely shorted out. The gas-powered fireplace, which had been off all night, suddenly roared to life on its own, burning with this massive, unnatural flame that threw wild shadows across the room. The TV in the corner snapped on by itself, volume dialed all the way up, blasting violent white static into the living room. It was pure chaos. It felt like something out of a cheap cliché horror movie, but it was happening right in front of me, in the middle of nowhere. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The TV clicked off, the fire died, the banging ceased. We sat there in the dark, barely breathing. The silence was deafening. And then, we heard the whispering. It was coming from right outside the massive uncovered windows. Faint, overlapping voices, frantic, urgent whispering, slipping through the cracks in the glass. I refused to turn my head. I was too completely, paralyzingly terrified to look at the windows. I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I turned my head and looked at the glass, I was going to see something looking back at me from the dark. We didn't sleep in the living room. We retreated to the only bedroom in the back, locked the heavy wooden door, and shoved a chair under the knob. I was too much of a coward to sleep in total darkness after that, so I left the hallway light on outside the bedroom. I figured the thin strip of yellow light shining under the crack of our door would give me some peace of mind, to let me know the hallway was empty. My voice trembled, barely able to get the words out. That false sense of security worked. Until the third night. We had managed to convince ourselves it was just local kids messing with us, or animals on the roof. We were exhausted. It was about 3 a.m. I was lying in bed wide awake, staring blankly at that thin strip of light under the door. The cabin was dead silent. And then, the light flickered. Something had stepped in front of the hallway bulb. A shadow slid slowly across the bottom of the door. Then, it stopped. The light under the crack was broken by 2 distinct dark shapes, like the toes of heavy boots. Someone or something was standing right outside our locked bedroom door, completely still, blocking the hall light. I stopped breathing. My chest tightened so hard I felt dizzy. I just watched those 2 dark spots cast onto the bedroom carpet, knowing that whatever had been banging on the walls with impossible speed, whatever had been whispering outside the windows in the dead of night, was now inside the house. It was standing inches away from me, separated only by an inch of wood. I spoke fast, desperate and breathless. We didn't wait to hear a knock. We didn't wait for the handle to turn. I grabbed my car keys off the nightstand, grabbed my friend by the shirt, and we bolted. We threw open the sliding glass door in the bedroom, sprinted out into the freezing Arkansas night, and ran blindly through the woods toward the dirt driveway. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to see what was standing in the window. We jumped in the car, locked the doors, and tore out of there, sliding on the gravel. My voice slowed down, sounding deeply traumatized. I lost my deposit on that place, and I left half my clothes behind. I don't care. I don't know if that cabin was built on some terrible history, or if there is something deeply wrong with those specific woods. But watching those shadows stand silently outside my door broke something in me. Some people love the thrill of camping. They love being isolated in the deep woods. But for me, I'm done. I'll stick to well-lit hotels from now on. I lay frozen under my blanket, listening to those heavy, unnatural footsteps pacing back and forth in our dark hallway. But the scariest part wasn't the thing standing at my bedroom door. It was knowing my strong, fearless father was awake in the next room, and he was too terrified to open his. My grandmother, my mama, was not the kind of woman who told ghost stories for fun. She was born and raised in a deeply rural, incredibly poor pocket of West Virginia. She was a strict, honest, God-fearing woman, the kind of woman who made sure the church doors never opened without her walking through them. I never once caught her in a lie. I never even heard her curse. So, when she told this story, she swore on her life that it was the absolute truth, and having grown up with her, I believe her. She told me that in the deep Appalachian mountains, there are people who still practice the old ways, dark magic, root work, hexes, and when she was a little girl, she learned exactly what happens when you cross them. My mama grew up with 7 brothers and sisters. Because they were so poor, survival depended entirely on her father, my great-grandfather Harrison. He was a hard, calloused mountain man. To keep his family fed, Harrison kept a massive garden. But the plot of land wasn't near their house. It was a good piece off, down a long, winding dirt road. This particular summer was punishing. It was the kind of extreme, suffocating heat that bakes the moisture right out of the soil and makes the air shimmer over the dirt roads. My mama nearly idolized her father, so despite the brutal heat, she would walk with him every single day to tend the crops. To bring the harvest back, they had to push a heavy, handmade wooden wagon. And to get back to their property, they had to push that creaking wagon right past the home of their neighbor, an old woman they called Aunt Kate. My mama was absolutely terrified of Aunt Kate. Aunt Kate lived alone in a sagging, weather-beaten shack that always seemed to be in the shade, even at high noon. But it wasn't the house that scared my mama. It was Kate's eyes. She was an older woman, and she had severe cataracts. Her eyes were completely clouded over, thick, milky white. When she looked in your direction, it felt like she was looking right through your skin and into whatever was hiding underneath. Late one August afternoon, my mama and Harrison were finishing up a grueling day in the garden. They had picked a massive load of green beans, enough to feed the family for weeks once they were canned. The wooden wagon was loaded to the brim. They started the long uphill push back home. As they crested the hill and approached Aunt Kate's property, the front door of the old shack creaked open. Aunt Kate stepped out onto the porch. She didn't have a cane. She didn't stumble. Despite those blind white eyes, she walked right to the edge of the porch and stopped, staring directly at the wagon. "Harrison," her voice rasped out, cutting through the humid air, "give me some of them beans you got there." It wasn't a request, it was a demand. My great-grandfather stopped pushing the wagon. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty rag. He was a proud man who worked his fingers to the bone for his children. He wasn't about to be bullied by the old woman everyone whispered about. "Kate," Harrison called back, his voice firm, "we worked hard for them beans, and we ain't giving 'em away." For a moment, nobody moved. The cicadas in the trees seemed to go dead silent. Then, Aunt Kate smiled. It was a thin, cruel smile. She let out a dry, rattling laugh that made the hair on my mama's arms stand straight up. "All right, Harrison," Kate chuckled, turning her blind white eyes toward the sky. "But you're going to regret that decision." Harrison didn't say another word. He just put his shoulder back against the wagon and pushed it the rest of the way up the hill to their home. My mama tried to push the old woman's laugh out of her mind. They got home, unloaded the beans, and went about their evening chores. The sun finally dipped below the mountains, offering a slight relief from the blistering heat. Because they had so many kids and so little space, sleeping arrangements were tight. Some of the kids shared a bed, and some, like my mama, slept on a pallet on the wooden floor in the hallway, with nothing but a thin, handmade quilt for a covering. The house grew quiet. The oil lamps were blown out. My mama lay on the hard floor, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling. The chirp of the crickets outside, the gentle breathing of her siblings. She was just starting to drift off to sleep. Her eyes snapped open in the pitch black. Something was in the house. My mama knew the sound of every footstep in that cabin. She knew the heavy, solid thud of her father's boots. She knew the light, quick pitter-patter of her younger brothers. This was neither. It sounded massive, heavier than a grown man, and it wasn't wearing shoes. It sounded like something with hard, dense pads or hooves stepping onto the floorboards and then dragging a dead, heavy limb behind it. The footsteps were coming from the front room, and they were moving slowly, deliberately down the dark hallway, towards the room where she was sleeping. My mama was paralyzed. She slowly reached up and pulled the thin quilt completely over her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, terrified that if she looked, she would see something standing over her in the dark. The dragging footsteps got closer. Thud! Drag! They were right outside the bedroom door. Thud. Drag. They crossed the threshold. My mama held her breath until her lungs burned. Underneath the thin blanket, the oppressive summer heat was suffocating, but she didn't dare move a muscle. Whatever it was, stopped, right at the foot of her pallet. It just stood there, in the dark. For what felt like an eternity, she lay, trapped under the covers, listening to the heavy, wet breathing of the thing standing at her feet. She prayed to God that her father would wake up. She prayed Harrison would come out of his room with his rifle and chase it away. But the house was dead silent. Harrison didn't come. Finally, the thing turned around. My mama let out a quiet, trembling breath, thinking it was leaving, thinking it was over. But it didn't leave the house. The footsteps walked down the length of the hallway, stopped, turned around, and came right back. It paced all night long. From the front room, down the hallway, into the doorway of the bedroom, stopping to stand over the terrified children, and then turning back around, back and forth, a relentless, agonizing patrol. My mama said she lay under that blanket for over 7 hours, trembling, soaked in sweat, completely broken by fear. And the worst part was the agonizing realization she had in the dark. Her father was a light sleeper. The house was tiny. The floorboards were screaming under the weight of this thing. Harrison was awake. And if her strong, fearless father was too terrified to open his bedroom door and confront whatever was walking the halls, then God help them all. The sun finally broke over the Appalachian ridges. As the first sliver of gray morning light crept through the cracks in the walls, the heavy footsteps stopped in the front room. And then there was just silence. A moment later, my mama heard the sharp, frantic sound of her father's bedroom door flying open. She threw the blanket off her face and darted down the hallway. When she burst into the kitchen, she froze. Harrison was standing at the table. He was fully dressed, but his hands were shaking violently. The proud, stoic man from the day before was gone. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and he was frantically grabbing handfuls of the green beans they had picked and stuffing them into a burlap sack. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak a single word about the night before. He just grabbed the sack of beans, grabbed my mama by the hand, and walked out the door. They walked quickly down the hill. They didn't take the wagon. Harrison practically dragged her down the dirt road until they reached Aunt Kate's sagging house. Aunt Kate was already outside. She was sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch, facing the road, waiting for them. Harrison marched right up to the edge of her property. He threw the heavy burlap sack of green beans into the dirt at the bottom of her porch stairs. He looked at the blind old woman, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. "Old woman," Harrison said, "take your booger back." For those unfamiliar with deep Appalachian folklore, a booger isn't a joke. It's the old mountain term for a dark spirit, a demon, a familiar summoned to torment a household. Aunt Kate stopped rocking. She turned her clouded white eyes toward Harrison, and then she smiled. "Don't worry, Harrison," Aunt Kate laughed, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "It won't bother you no more." They turned around and walked back up the hill. My mama said they never spoke of that night again. But my mama lived a long life, and until the day she died, she swore that the blind woman in the holler was dealing with the dark side, because whatever was pacing their hallway that night, it didn't belong to this earth. No matter how fast we sprinted down that pitch-black trail, the mechanical, stuttering voice in the trees remained at the exact same volume. It never lost ground, and it never stopped to breathe, because whatever was pacing us in the dark wasn't human. I have lived in southern West Virginia my entire life. If you aren't from around here, it's hard to explain what the geography does to you. The woods and the mountains surround you in every single direction. They box you in. The roads wind through deep valleys, and the trees grow so thick that they block out the horizon. And when night falls over these ridges, it brings a kind of darkness that you cannot possibly understand unless you have stood in it. It is absolute. It swallows the light from the stars, and it swallows sound. In the deep woods of Appalachia, darkness isn't just the absence of light. It feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. This happened about 3 years ago. I'm telling it to you now, typing it out for the archive, because keeping it to myself hasn't helped. It still brings me genuine physical stress just to think about it. My heart rate goes up, my palms sweat, and I have to check the locks on my doors. Because what I encountered out there wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human. It was a typical weekend. I was hanging out at my house with a friend, let's call him Mark. We were doing what guys do in small mountain towns when there's absolutely nothing going on. We watched UFC fights, played some Xbox, ordered food, just burning time. Around 1 a.m., the boredom started to turn into cabin fever. Mark had just bought one of those high-beam tactical flashlights, the heavy military-grade ones that cost way too much money and can throw a beam of blinding white light hundreds of yards through the pitch black. He had been playing with it in my living room all night, and he finally said he wanted to test it out in the actual woods. So we decided to take a drive. There's a hiking trail located just a few miles from my property. It isn't a particularly long trail, maybe a 3-mile loop, but it cuts directly through some exceptionally dense, old-growth forest. We hopped in Mark's car, and took the winding back roads to the trailhead. When we parked, the isolation immediately set in. There were no streetlights out here, no houses, just Mark's car, the gravel lot, and the massive looming wall of trees standing before us like a black curtain. Mark clicked the flashlight on. The beam was incredible. It cut a harsh, perfect tunnel of white light right through the darkness, illuminating the dirt path leading into the trees. We stepped onto the trail. As soon as we crossed the tree line, the canopy above us closed, blocking out the sky. We were completely cut off from the outside world. For the first 20 minutes, it was just a regular hike. We were talking, joking around, shining the flashlight up into the massive branches. But as we got deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to shift. It started subtly, a strange, heavy feeling in the air. We hiked about 30 minutes in, right to the halfway point of the trail. The woods were so thick here that stepping off the path meant you would be lost in seconds. We stopped in a small clearing. Mark clicked the flashlight off so we could let our eyes adjust to the dark and just chill for a minute. As we stood there in the pitch black, I noticed something deeply unsettling. The forest was too alive. Now, there are always noises in the woods at night. You hear the occasional rustle of a raccoon, the hoot of an owl, the steady chirp of crickets. But the sheer volume of animal activity buzzing around us right now was completely unnatural for 1:30 in the morning. It was chaotic. We could hear heavy brush snapping violently in the distance, as if herds of deer were running blindly through the thicket. We heard birds shifting aggressively in the canopy above us, flapping their wings in the dark. The insects were screaming in a frantic, deafening chorus. It was eerie. Animals usually hunker down at night to avoid predators. When the forest gets this agitated, when the wildlife is in an active state of panic, it usually means a massive predator, like a black bear or a mountain lion, is moving through the area, pushing everything else out of its way. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck. I nudged Mark in the dark. "Turn the light back on," I whispered. "We need to go back." The second the light hit the trees, the forest died. Every single sound vanished. It didn't fade out. It was cut off. It was that suffocating, vacuum-sealed silence that survivalists call the Oz effect. The wind stopped. The insects stopped. The birds went dead still. Mark and I froze. We didn't even take a breath. The only sound in the entire world was the frantic, heavy pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Mark slowly swept the beam of the flashlight across the tree line, illuminating the pale trunks of oak and pine, looking for the glowing eyes of a bear. There was nothing, just empty, silent woods. And then, out of the suffocating silence, the voice started. It was coming from the deep woods, somewhere about 40 yards off the trail to our right. My blood ran completely cold, because whatever was speaking, it didn't sound human. It sounded humanoid. It was shaky, uncertain, mocking. The best way I can describe it is the sound of an old, broken children's toy. You know those cheap toys with the terrible speakers, where the robotic voice gets warped and demonic when the batteries are dying? It sounded exactly like that. A synthetic, crackling, broken voice echoing through the ancient trees of West Virginia. It was saying words, but the syllables were jumbled, like it was trying to mimic human speech, but it didn't understand how a throat or a tongue worked. It was just replicating the frequency. Every single primal instinct in my DNA screamed one word: run. I didn't look at Mark. Mark didn't look at me. We didn't say a word. We bolted. We spun around and sprinted directly back down the trail we had just walked. Mark was running slightly ahead of me, the heavy tactical flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The beam was slashing chaotically through the darkness, casting terrifying, jagged, 10-foot-tall shadows that danced across the trees like monsters reaching out to grab us. I was running so fast I could barely feel my legs. Branches whipped my face, tearing at my skin, but I didn't care. I just kept my eyes locked on the bouncing white light ahead of me. But as we ran, a new wave of absolute paralyzing horror washed over me. The sound wasn't gaining distance, but it wasn't fading behind us either. No matter how fast we sprinted down that winding dirt path, dodging roots and rocks in the dark, the eerie, mechanical voice remained at the exact same volume. It was pacing us. It was moving perfectly parallel to us, deep in the thick, impenetrable brush to our right. I knew how dense those woods were. A human being could not run through those thorns and thickets at a full sprint without a flashlight. But this thing was effortlessly keeping up with two young men running for their lives, and it just kept speaking, over and over, a continuous, broken, crackling stream of mimicry with absolutely no pausing for breath, because whatever was making that sound didn't need oxygen. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like lead. We'd been sprinting for over 15 minutes and the adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by pure, exhausting terror. Crack, bzzzt, crackle. The voice was right there, just behind the veil of the trees. I was convinced in my bones that we were not making it out of those woods. I kept waiting to feel a massive, heavy hand grab the back of my jacket and pull me violently into the dark. I kept waiting for the flashlight to die. I pushed myself harder. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't spare the air. Finally, after sprinting blindly for what felt like an agonizing eternity, the thick wall of trees ahead of us began to thin out. Through the bouncing beam of the flashlight, I could see the faint amber glow of the streetlights near the gravel parking lot. We were almost there. We were maybe 5 minutes from the exit. The mechanical voice suddenly stopped. For a fraction of a second, I felt a massive wave of relief. We had outrun it. We had reached the edge of its territory. We were going to make it. From directly behind us, the silence was shattered by a scream. My heart completely stopped beating. Listen to me very carefully. I grew up in these mountains. I have hunted in them. I know exactly what a mountain lion sounds like when it screams. I know what an injured deer sounds like. I know the cry of a bobcat. This was not an animal. And this was not a person playing a prank in the woods at 2 a.m. The sheer volume of it sent hundreds of birds exploding out of their nests in the canopy above us. It was a bone-shaking, heart-stopping, murderous shriek. It sounded like tearing metal mixed with the roar of a predator. It was the most genuinely depraved, violent sound I have ever heard in my 20-something years on this earth. It was the sound of something furious, something enraged that its prey was crossing the threshold out of its domain. We didn't look back. We didn't slow down. We hit the gravel parking lot, practically diving into Mark's car. He didn't even shut his door before he threw it into reverse, the tires spinning and throwing rocks as we tore out of the lot and sped down the winding mountain road back toward civilization. I have only told this story to maybe 3 people in my life. Every single one of them brushed it off. They laughed. They told me it was a bobcat or an owl, or just my imagination running wild in the dark. I stopped trying to convince them. I have never been the type of person to push for the existence of the paranormal. I don't go looking for ghosts or cryptids. I believe in what I can see. But I know what I heard that night. I know how the forest reacted to it. And I know that a human being cannot sprint through a pitch-black forest of thorns while projecting a mechanical voice without taking a single breath. I genuinely believe that whatever paced us through the dark that night, it was not from this world, and I will never, for as long as I live, step foot in that trail again.